Hello dear chess friends of International Chess School. In this lecture we will continue to discuss about how we're gonna attack the opponent's king remained in the center. Not all the time the battle has a dynamic character. Sometimes we have to deal with the enemy king in the center when the position presents a lot of statical elements. We called such positions settled positions. But anyway, the position of the enemy king along the central files has some negative consequences, and in this game we will see how White creates the preconditions of the attack and how he realizes the attack. The game is extracted from the European Team Championship played in November 2011 between the international master from Macedonia, Franceschi Filip, against the grandmaster Gimeshi Zoltan, rated 2652. Even such high-rated players can be the victim of a king attack from Hungary. It started with e4, c6. We call these half-open games, but White will play cautiously, and it will avoid the early opening of the central files. Knight c3, d5, queen e2. Now White reinforces the defense of the e4 pawn, and if d takes e4, knight takes e4, then he will be able to use the third rank for the queen in order to create threats with the long range pieces. e6, g3, knight f6, bishop g2. White plays like in the King's Indian attack. He first wants to activate his pieces, and only after that to determine the pawn structure. At the same time, for Black, it's pretty difficult to develop, especially the light squares bishop. He made a big concession when he pushed e6, and the bishop remained trapped there. And the main consequence of this fact is that Black can't castle long, as the h2 b8 diagonal is also weak, and White can install at any time a bishop on f4. So sooner or later Black will have to commit to castle short, but White is aware, and he will try to keep the Black king in the center. Bishop b4. Now if d4, White will regroup his knight by playing knight d1, knight d1, knight f2, or knight b1, knight d2, and he will have the space advantage on the king side. If you draw a line between the e file and the d file, we will notice that White has an overwhelming space advantage on the king side. So Black tries to keep the central tension and played bishop b4. This is justified by the fact that there's some central pressure on e4, so Black wants to get rid of the knight from c3. White accepted the invitation, e5, and used the fact that bishop b4 is also a commitment. And the consequence is that the g7 square, the g7 pawn, is unprotected and may be vulnerable. Knight fd7. Please take a look now if Black can afford to castle short. I don't think so. behind the important pawn from e5, white will be able to prepare a slow attack, exactly like in the King's Indian attack, and create a local forces superiority. So black is left with little choices. Knight f3, knight a6. Black tries to refrain from pushing c6, c5, and maybe he wants to create pressure against e5 with the bishop a5, bishop c7, and to use the fact that after d2, d4, c5, white is not able to push c2, c3 for the moment, a French type pawn structure. But after short castle, black didn't continue with this plan. It is too slow, and during this time white will have the time to prepare the typical breakthrough f4, f5. So black played knight c7. He still keeps the king in the center and tries to create counterplay on the queen side before he determines the position of his king. His king is pretty stable and solid, is well defended for the time being in the center, but we know that a king in the center not only restricts the activity of the surrounding pieces, it also breaks the link between the rooks. So white should have already this idea to activate his rooks and to use the fact that the opponent's rooks will be terribly passive. d3, b6, and knight d1, as white has the space advantage and a certain preponderance in the center due to the e5 pawn. He will avoid exchanges, and he leaves the bishop from b4 somehow in the air without a defined role. When we evaluate, when we assess the value of a minor piece, we consider the role played by that piece in the first place. Secondly, we assess the mobility of this piece, and only in the third place the position, the placement, if the piece is on an outpost or not. Bishop e7, as the bishop on d4 is no longer needed. Black regrouped, and now h4. The h-pawn advance in this case is not justified. Usually we use this when black already pushed g7, g6, and we want to open the h file with h4, h5. But the main idea, the basic idea behind this pawn push is that white wants to be ready when black will castle short, which means that black will have second thoughts about castling short after h4, which creates an excellent rampant on g5 for white's pieces. A bishop can land there, or a knight, releasing the queen and the f pawn. For example, if black plays short castle here, going directly into the attack, white will continue in the King's Indian attack fashion. Bishop f4, slowly building the attack, as black's queen side is undeveloped and there's no danger. White has no weaknesses on the queen side, and it is pretty difficult for black to open files there and to create counterplay. So the position is settled, which means that white can continue quietly. And when we have this settled statical position, the king's position plays an important role, and in this case the king's position is assessed by the number of pieces surrounding the king. The king from g8 is pretty lonely, and there's a certain inflexibility in black's pawn structure. Black cannot advance the pawns in front of his king, while white can easily advance h5, g4, f4, even g5, and together a lot of pieces and long-range acting pieces behind the pawns before it decides to open a file. Bishop b7, knight e3, c5, maybe black tries something like d4, knight d5 to get rid of this useless knight from c7, knight g5, h6, creating the weakness. Otherwise white can play queen h5 and even leave the knight on g5. This could be a good idea. For example, if a black doesn't push h5, for example b5, then queen h5, h6, and now maybe white can even leave the knight there. He can regroup with knight h3, and then g3, g4 to put pressure on this pawn weakness. This kind of pawn is called a hook, since white can build his counterplay on that pawn. But another idea could be knight g5, when after h takes g5, h takes g5, white's PC superiority is pretty dangerous. For example, g6, now queen h4, threatening knight f6, and then to bring a pawn there and to mate on g7. This kind of square is called by Vukovic a focal square. G8 is the mating square, where the black king can be mated, and the G7 square is a focal square. You should always look for the focal squares. If there are any squares where you can bring your pieces in order to make the opponent king, in order to carry out such an attack successfully, sacrificing a piece, it is always important to imagine mating patterns, to prepare a mating net. This means depriving the opponent's king of its escape squares, and the escape square in this case is only f8. So with the queen h6, at some point you will deprive the black king from the f8 square, and of course concentrate on the mating focal points. Another focal point could be h7 after rook h1, for example, creating the battery queen and rook, which is very dangerous since it threatens mate also on h7 and h8. So black's tasks in defense are very difficult in this position, since there are a lot of focal points, the points from where your pieces can deliver the mate to the opponent king. For example, bishop c6, trying to bring the bishop on e8, as now knight f6, or even maybe king h2, simply preparing rook h1 and king g1 back. So this attack can continue this way. Why white didn't play immediately queen h6? Because black has always the defensive resource based on bishop f8, bishop g7 covering the squares. Now after rook e8, rook h1, bishop f8, for example, knight f6, knight takes g takes f6, the black king is in a trap, and after king g1, queen h8, the black king will be mated. This is the spirit of the King's Indian attack, and if you want to improve your knowledge about this strategical opening, you can follow the games of the ex-world champion Robert James Fischer. So after knight g5, h6, I want to show you another way to continue to carry out the attack. Knight h3, queen c8, queen g4, white is immediately threatening to take on h6, king h8, queen h5, d4, bishop takes, queen takes, knight g4, and the pressure against h6 is already high. The black king is isolated. If you draw a line between the files F and E, we will notice that white has an overwhelming pieces superiority, and everything is fine. In case the attacker has an huge pieces superiority like this, great knowledge or ability is not needed. White has only has to find the focal squares and to deliver the mate after it created such a pieces superiority. But if the superiority just borders and we don't know exactly which will justify a correct attack, then the attacking player should have the skill, and for this reason it has to ponder very deeply in the critical moments. We will talk about later about the critical moments of the game. So now queen d5 and rook fe1 or rook ae1, consolidating e5 and preparing the decisive blow on h6. So after h4, black's decision to remain with the king in the center was somehow justified, but he has to act quickly on the queen side and even to prepare the long castle. I can't see how to do that. If he wants, for example, to play bishop a6, queen c8, and then to put the queen on b7, then the queen will be opposed to the powerful bishop from g2 if he wants to castle long like this. Otherwise, if he wants to reach c7 with the queen, then the knight from c7 will be in the queen's way. White has a space advantage. He avoided pieces exchanges, and this leads to this passive position for black. Black played h5, and it is obvious that the black king will remain in the center for a longer period of time, which is the standard to-do list when the enemy king is in the center. First, we have to maintain the enemy king in the center as long as possible. This is somehow solved, this point on the to-do list, since trying to stop the h-pawn, black just create new weaknesses on light squares around the king's side. Secondly, white has to open files or diagonals against the enemy king, which is the reason behind opening the files, to facilitate the activity of your pieces and to create future weaknesses around the enemy king. after you open files or diagonals, try to increase the pressure with the help of the initiative. And Black's defensive tasks are difficult, since the rook's connection is broken, and it means that the black rooks cannot participate in defense. But let's establish first if the position has a dynamic character or a static one, a settled one. I would say that the position has a settled character, and it is not necessary for white to rush in this case, since on medium term black can't improve the position of his king. White has the space advantage, has a better pawn structure. As you can see, there are not undefended pawns in white's camp, while g7 and c6 and even f7 are weak. And what's more important is the king's position on long term, the mobility of the kings. While the white king is safe, the black king is stuck in the center and also lack mobility. So due to the settled character of the position, white can continue to improve the position of his pieces. Bishop b7. Now there's no other active move, so white played c4. It is not clear whether it would be able to open the c file or the e file, but creating tension between the pawns will bring white a step further in his to-do list idea to open files or diagonals. Unfortunately, we cannot say how many moves will take each phase of the to-do list, but you have to know during the game where you are. And now we are on the second phase, trying to open files or diagonals. a5, which is the consequence of a5. The b5 square is somehow weakened, so knight c3. It takes b5 under control and create a link between the white rooks. b5. During this time, black is also forced to find active play. If he stays still, as you saw in the previous variation, white will create a local forces superiority, and especially against the f7 square, which is an important focal squares. The focal squares for the king in the center are these: f7, f6, these 8 squares, this rectangle in front of the black king. These are the squares where white can deliver mate if the position will open up. b3, a4. Black has a piece superiority on the queen side, and he tries to activate these pieces: the rook from a8, the bishop from b7, the knight from c7. Bishop g5 as the possibility of opening a line or a file around the black king appears. White has to realize which is the defender, and in this case this bishop does a good job. It keeps d6 and f6 under control both, and at the same time it defends the square where it is, e7, and these 3 are focal points, while the bishop from f4 didn't do any great job. Just supporting the pawn from behind is not big deal. So exchanging the most important defender is useful. After bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, the knight took 2 focal squares under control. very important, and it used the consequence of the rushed move h7, h5, which created a sort of outpost on g5. Since f7, f6 is not a good idea, weakening the e6 pawn. Queen e7, black eventually gained the right to castle long, but this is not an option. The king will fail under severe attack, especially along the c file, which is very predictable to be open, since after c takes b5 or c takes d5, the c file will be open. So in fact the queen tried to pick up the tasks of the dark square's bishop, but the queen from e7 is not so efficient in defending especially the d6 square, where white has an e5 pawn. This means that the d5 pawn has to stay here in order to defend e4, and the why e4? Because white is threatening knight e4, knight d6, or knight c3, knight d6, and also the c6 pawn has to be there in order to defend against knight b5, knight d6. White tried to eliminate the c6 pawn, so c takes b5, c takes b5. Now the b5 pawn is vulnerable, which means that the knight from c7 is stuck there. It has to defend the b5 pawn. It is obvious that the knight from c7 is very vulnerable. It's not a stable position, it's not defended, it's in the air, and at the same time a knight which values 3 points has to defend a pawn. It is obvious that white can take advantage of it. Of course, he could have played b takes a4 first, b takes a4, but in such cases the experience, the intuition tells you that you have to act right away. The c file was open, the second phase was realized. White managed to open the important c file, which is in the proximity of the black king. It may look that there are no threats from the c file against the black king, but soon you'll realize that these threats exist. So he played immediately rook fc1 without taking care of the pawn. A takes b3, and now in the spirit of the attack against king in the center, when initiative from the experience can easily disappear, when the active side doesn't choose the right to-do list or the right moves with the maximum impact. We are now in the third phase, when we have to amplify the activity of our pieces and to create dangerous threats against the enemy king. We have kept the enemy king in the center, we have opened important files and even diagonals, especially this diagonal can be vulnerable for the black king, and now white was ready for action. He played knight ce4, opening the c file, threatening rook c7, from where the rook exerts a terrible pressure. This kind of superiority is needed. If the enemy rooks are stuck on the initial position, if the active side manages to activate his rooks, and he can bring the other rook behind to double up the rooks along the c file, then he will have the upper hand. Now black accepted the material. This is usually a good idea if you're on a passive defensive position. At least you should grab the material, but knight takes e5 was much better, eliminating this dangerous pawn and defending the c7 knight at the same time. But after knight c5, f6, knight takes b7, b2, with the purpose of a knight d3 double attack. Queen takes b2, knight d3, queen d4, knight c1, rook takes c1. Even here white has a strong initiative. Black's pieces are lacking mobility, and there's no coordination between black's pieces. F takes g5, queen b6, short castle, rook takes, queen f6. The f2 square is protected. So h takes g5, queen e5, and knight c5, attacking e6, preparing knight e6 and supporting rook g7. But at least black solved the king's problem. He managed to put the king safe on g8. Anyway, I would say that white has the advantage here. But after knight c4, black considered that it is important to eliminate one of the attackers, the knight from e4, which threatened knight d6. This was the threat behind knight e4. Not only that it threatens rook takes c7, but it is also a multi-purpose move. So after d takes e4, rook c7, probably black believed that he has some counter chances based on the b3 pawn. In fact, there are two major pieces there which easily can cope with that free pawn. E takes d3, queen takes d3. There's no science rockets needed here. White will simply pile up on this pin. The knight from d7 is the target. It is a focal point, it is a pin here, and all white has to do is to over-attack the pinned piece. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2. Now queen d8, I believe, is the only move, since for example, after rook d8, a takes b3, king f8, or something like b4, I don't know, b4, rook a7. And if king f8 here, for example, then rook d1, and the knight is lost, the rook from h8 is out of play, and the attack against the enemy king is still rolling. So if you manage to reach such an overwhelming piece superiority, you don't have to sacrifice, you don't have to take risks, you can lower your risks. Black played queen d8, get rid of the pin and attacks the rook. Now please consider some candidate moves before I show you the move played by white. If rook c1, then b2, and black's idea to keep the pawn on b3 will be justified. The rook from a1 has to conquer the d file, so it belongs to the d1 square. For this reason, white played rook b7. One rook will be active along the 7th rank, the other rook will come on d1 in order to gain the knight. If b takes a2 here, white has to focus on the focal squares, and there's no time in this case for rook d1, since the pawn will be promoted. a1 queen, but after knight takes f7, bringing the knight on a focal square, it leaves black without protection. It attacks the queen, the rook, and if king takes f7, then rook d7, winning the black queen. Other variation could be b2 here, attacking the rook, but rook d1 If b1 queen, then queen takes b1, and at the next move white will exchange two rooks which values 10 points for a queen, and a knight which values 12 points, which is a favorable exchange, and the attack remains on the board. Another possibility here will be rook a2, but black didn't play with a purpose. It is hard to believe that he will manage to change the character of the battle. Rook d1, b2 for example, trying to promote, but rook takes d7. Unfortunately for black, white controls firmly the b1 square, and it has all the time in the world to deliver mate. Queen a8, king h2, and rook d8 is threatened at the next move, so white is completely winning. After rook b7, black played queen c8, trying to chase, to deflect white's rook from the dangerous 7th rank. Queen b5, defending the rook and creating a new pin along a4 e8 diagonal. Eventually this diagonal has been open, and the white queen, which aimed for the entire game the move 25, arrives on b5. Rook a5, queen b4, rook a4, using the fact that the queen has to defend the rook. In such positions, white should refrain from exchanging pieces. His pieces are all very active, and he don't want to trade for such kind of pieces. Especially this rook is much more active than the rook from h8. So what white has to do is to bring fresh forces into the battle. Queen takes b3 was also possible. He played queen b5, and after rook a5, one defensive possibility is to attack a piece from the same rank. Rook c1, rook takes b5, rook takes c8 check, king e7, rook takes b5, rook takes c8, a takes b3, and I will show quickly the important moment is gone. White transformed his threats against the enemy king into a material advantage, and it played for the mate for most of the game, but now he has to convert the positional advantage. f6, e takes, g takes, knight e4, e5, not d2, king e6, king f3, rook c3, king e2, not c5, rook b6 check, king f5. These weaknesses are still there. White's position is compact, and the free pawn is extremely dangerous. Rook c6, pinning the knight, e4, b4, knight a4, rook a6. The knight is trapped. If knight b2, then rook takes f6, followed by knight e4 check, rook. This is the point. So black was forced to play rook a3, pinning himself. Rook a5, king g4, knight e4, knight c3, knight takes, rook takes c3. Maybe here white had something better, like king f1, setting a mate net. The king is stuck on g4. It has only 2 freedom degrees, f3 and h3, and the mating idea should be king f1, king g2, followed by f3. For example, king f1, and if knight takes e4, rook a3, and if rook takes f6, then b takes, and after knight takes e4, a6, and the pawn can't be stopped. Anyway, this is difficult during the game. White keep it simple. Knight takes e3, rook takes c3, his 2 pawns up, rook c5, rook b3, rook c4, king f5, rook f4, king e5. Now the f2 pawn is defended, and the b4 pawn also, so the white king came to support the pawn. In these cases, the rook has to defend against the enemy threats, and the king has to defend the own free pawn. King d2, rook a3, king c2, king e6, b5, rook a5, rook b4. Rook behind the pawn now. There's nothing to do about the advance of the pawn. King d7, b6, king c8, king d3, king b7, king e3, rook c5, king f4, rook c2, f3, and in front of the threat g4, followed by the periods of a second free passed pawn along the h file. Black resigned. Let's summarize the important things in this game about the attack against the king in the center. With the move h4, White showed his aggressive intention. He gives blacks second thoughts about castling short. It fulfills all the phases of the to-do list when the enemy king is in the center. Maintaining the king as long as possible in the center, then open lines, files, diagonals against the enemy king, and then with the help of the initiative and of the provoking moves, try to amplify the value of your pieces, especially the rooks. When the rooks have been penetrating along the 7th rank, the game was almost over. Black defended well, so it took the endgame for White to win. I hope you enjoyed this game, and till our next lecture, best wishes.